Hey everyone, Coach Byer from Performance Center. Welcome to our lecture on periodization for sport. This presentation, we're going to go over some key concepts and factors that play a role in our decision making when developing long-term training programs for our athletes. All right, so the first thing that we're going to do is identify and define our different training phases of the year. Since periodization revolves around our movement from one phase into the next, leading into our competitive season or events. So the first phase is as soon as the season has ended or after the final competition is our transition phase. This is where our goal is to have our athletes return physically and mentally fresh. We promote active recovery and our athletes kind of getting out of their sport but still staying active. After that, we have our off season, which for us is the most valuable time of the year for athletic development. This is where we can train our athletes hard and make them bigger, faster, stronger, whatever it is that they may need to help excel at their sport. In other words, this is where we can expand our athletes' toolbox and build their car engine. After off season, we then enter our preseason, where our focus is more on technical and tactical work. They'll have more team practices and meetings, and our focus in training is to make sure that our training is now transferring into what our athletes are doing in practice. So we've built the car engine in the off season and preseason. Now we're teaching the athletes how to drive the car. So we're trying to apply the adaptations that we've made. And finally, we have our in-season phase where physical development kind of takes a back seat as technical and tactical preparations become paramount. And our goal is to maintain our physicality and decrease our risk of injury. And our exercise selections become more relevant or plane specific to sport demands. And we want to make sure that we're still giving the athletes what they're not getting in their sport. And another couple terms that we want to define when speaking of periodization are peaking and tapering. Now, often these two are used interchangeably, but in fact they mean two fairly different things. So peaking is the means of optimizing performance. That's it. It's being in an ideal state to perform optimally. Components of peaking, however, may include things like watching film, honing specific skills in practice, executing tactical strategies, and or tapering. So peaking is a state of being ready to compete. How we achieve a peak is going to vary depending on our athletes and how much time we spend, whether it's training in the weight room on the field, during practice, or in the film room, is going to change depending on what our athletes need to peak. A taper is a tool that we can use to achieve a peak and a tool that we can use if necessary. So traditionally, a taper is seen as part of a cut in training volume or intensity leading up to a competition. But what happens if we have a team sport athlete whose competition season is 82 games long, or they have to be as good on day one as they are on day 70 of their competition season? Well, we can't think that we can have a 70-day taper. We can't reduce training volume or intensity for 70 whole days, because then our athletes' physical attributes are going to regress. So all the work they put in the offseason, all the progress they made, they're going to regress if we reduce volume and intensity for that long. So tapering is something that we can insert into our overall in-season training to maintain our peak. Our goal of a taper is really just to reduce aspects of training that cause fatigue in order to mitigate fatigue. So if it's the volume that's causing fatigue in our athletes, a taper would be removing that volume. If it's the intensity that's causing fatigue in our athletes, a taper would be reducing the intensity. So it's dependent on what is causing fatigue and just reducing that amount. So that's why we see like tapers maybe more towards the end of the season, because our athletes are building up fatigue, and that's where we might want to taper, just because we want to keep our athletes fresh. Because an athlete that's fatigued is not going to be as good as an athlete, obviously, that's fresh and ready to go. So when talking about periodization, a topic that comes up pretty often is the yearly training plan, or a YTP, because a YTP is basically just a map or a plan that outlines the training schedule for an athlete or a team throughout an entire year. So it is encompassing of a multitude of variables to improve performance and peak for competitions. It outlines planned phases, intensities, volumes throughout the year based on the adaptations that are planned to be targeted. And it can be as detailed as outlining set rep schemes, tempos, rest, durations, and it considers time of year, major competitions, holidays, breaks. So it considers all the phases that we talked about earlier, and also inserting taper weeks or peaks into times where we may think that they're needed. So here we have a couple samples of YTPs. They're just outlined in great detail about what adaptations, what type of training that these athletes are going to be doing throughout the entire year. They outline every week, every month of the training year, basically just predicting what is going to be trained through weeks 36 to 52 or weeks 12 to 18 of the season, all in advance. Now, YTPs can be built for, like I said, a season, a year, or an Olympic cycle, but they're not to be confused with what we call macro cycles. So over time, a YTP allows you to compare previous plans, ideally to improve and adjust upon the preceding years. And the purpose of it is to guide programming around athlete sport demands to optimize results and peak appropriately. Now in a YTP, as you're trying to map out and plan the entire training year, you'll be including components like major competitions that are scheduled, holidays and breaks, things that may be out of your control, your strength training emphasis based on, again, how far you are from your competition, what you think the athletes will need at that time, your energy system emphasis, development emphasis, your speed and sprinting emphasis, and your workload breakdown where you try to plan your volume and intensity throughout the entire training year. Now, as great as the YTP looks, and as great as it maps out a theoretical idea for what we're trying to achieve with our periodization strategy throughout the year, we also have to keep in mind that it goes a lot deeper than just designing sets and reps. So we're trying to plan an entire year while considering all the previously mentioned variables, which is very realistic. There are always things that will pop up that we can't account for. For example, if you're in a team setting, it could be a coach that says, no, we're cutting half our workouts this week because we played terribly and we need to do more film. Or it could be injuries or people taking vacations or people needing to study for exams and whatnot. So there's a lot of variables that we just simply can't see coming over the span of 6, 8, 12 months. That's going to change what we end up planning and changing our YTP. Subjectively speaking, most coaches on average are only going to complete 15 to 20% of their YTP that's written at the beginning of the season. Just because there's so many adjustments and changes that are going to need to be made, it's nearly impossible to stay on schedule. So now we're going to ask, maybe, is there a better way to approaching our periodization strategies than a YTP? So one thing that we recommend is being agile, and if anything, and planning that far ahead just to paint a broad picture. And instead, we would rather prioritize smaller macro cycles that last 8 to 12 weeks, as opposed to training out or planning out 52 weeks of training throughout the year. What we try to do is plan Negativa. That means planning to avoid what most will fail at instead of what few may succeed at. And we want to have an idea of where we'd like our athletes and teams to be, but also plan for where they most likely will end up. So that means we could still have target deadlines, and we could still have goals to hit certain metrics by certain points. However, this allows us to adjust and provide the athletes with what we believe that they need at that moment in time to achieve those KPIs or benchmarks or what have you in the off season. So this allows us to have focused adaptation intents and give our athletes or team what they need when they need it. So for example, on a YTP, you might have 6 weeks in, 8 weeks in, we need to go from strength to power, 3 weeks of each. Whereas we can take a look at this macro cycle approach, and being agile, we can say, okay, maybe we need a little bit more time in the strength phase. Maybe our athletes aren't ready for a power phase just yet. Maybe our athletes need to put a little more size. We need to have more time spent in a hypertrophy block. This allows us to adjust for how the athletes respond to our own training programs instead of trying to force them on a set schedule throughout the entire year. So now we'll move on to how we actually build a simple macro cycle. So this system is not perfect by any means, but it does make sense. We have to keep in mind whether we are training a team or individual athletes. We have to keep in mind the time of the year, as I outlined earlier, the phases, and the sport demand. So what our athletes are going to be needing at the end of their training, what the metrics and benchmarks they're going to need to be hitting. We have to keep in mind our competition and sport priorities when training in season. We can plan for breaks, and we also need to keep in mind coaches' opinions and injury history coaches' opinions, because again, they must adapt to how their season is going. They have to change strategies all the time, so we have to be ready to work with them and change as they see fit, which is a lot harder to do, again, with a yearly training plan. If coach is going to be making adjustments mid-season, then you have to be prepared to do that as well. So breaking up that YTP into smaller chunks is helpful for that. A couple things we can consider using for our macro cycles is graded workouts. We can have different levels based on our athletes' training ages. We can adjust for different positions. For example, pitchers or fielders in baseball can have different programs. We don't have to generalize the program to fit the entire team. And we can also adjust for different anthropometrics, like tall and short athletes, or guards and bigs in basketball can be adjusted for when we're planning in smaller blocks. So after we've done all our information gathering and taken all our input, it's time to now build our sample or our simple macro cycle. Our first step is to select an appropriate macro cycle goal. So this is what we determine after taking everything into consideration, what the athletes can best benefit from over the next 8 to 12 weeks. And then we can select our periodization strategy, whether we go triphasic or conjugate or whatever it may be, if we go linear, blocked, whatever helps our athletes get there at the end of that 8 to 12 week macro cycle. We can strategize for that because it's a lot easier to predict what's going to happen in the next 2 to 3 months than the next 10 to 12 months. Then we can select our appropriate mesocycle goals. So we have 2 to 4 week mini goals where we can change our training focuses on even smaller scales in order to achieve that macrocycle goal. However, we have to keep in mind that these smaller mesocycle goals should still complement the overall macrocycle goal. And then finally, most detailed, we'll put together our microcycles. We'll select our set rep schemes, our intensities, and appropriate exercises, considering all of our factors like training age, time of year, position, demands, needs from our athlete, to select our individual workouts, again, that feed into our mesocycle, which feed into our macrocycle. So over here we have an example of a macrocycle goal, which is max effort, and then we have 4 3-week mesocycles that will help us achieve that macrocycle goal. So our first 3 weeks, we're focusing on functional hypertrophy. We have example set rep schemes and intensities that we'd like to hit, very general parameters like 30 to 50 total reps, 70 to 85% of the 1 rep max. And our meso 2 goal is our near max strength. Again, we have parameters that target that mesocycle goal, strength, speed, and then back to near max strength, where we have our individual workouts then feeding into our mesocycle goals, which together will feed into our macrocycle goal. So the great thing about using macrocycles to plan out 8 to 12 weeks in advance at time is it gives us an opportunity to assess, not only assess, but adjust as well. So in a yearly training plan, you can still plan out when you're going to have assessments. However, if you're on a schedule, what are you actually doing with those assessments is what we would ask. Because if an assessment tells you you need 2 more weeks of strength, or maybe you need to spend more time in strength as opposed to power, or you have to develop more speed at for a couple more weeks, that throws you off schedule in your yearly training plan. The whole thing kind of gets off put. However, in a macrocycle goal, we can actually take these assessments and then use those assessments to plan every individual macrocycle. So we can, after 8 to 12 weeks, we can go do our 10 to 20 yard sprint times, our different jump tests, strength tests, and then we can use that information to plan the next 8 to 12 weeks, as opposed to using that information and then adjusting to a preset schedule, or throwing out this preset schedule where we're going to substitute it for an 8 to 12 week adjustment anyways. Finally, we're going to talk a little bit about our periodization hierarchy here for our team setting versus our private or individual setting athletes, as the two differ from one another quite a bit actually. So Our goal of training is to get our athletes better at their sport. So what makes them better at their sport? Well, that's where their sport coach will probably come to consideration. So in our example here, our team metric, what the coach thinks is going to help the team win more games is by improving rebounding. So then we have to, after we have our team metric, we have to take the time of year into consideration. So let's say we're 3 months out of the regular season, so we're in the mid to late off season here, or middle of the off season. So in a team setting, we see the team metric and we can determine what our KPIs are. So what's going to help us get more rebounds as a team overall. So our KPI in this case would be improving our vertical. Then we choose the general adaptation that would allow most people to improve their vertical. Thus what we think would help improve rebounding. And then we have to fit our individuals into that adaptation. So the whole team's going to train power regardless of whether some need to get bigger or some need to get stronger. We've already determined that our KPI based on the team metric that we're trying to improve feeds into the adaptation that our individuals have to adjust to. However, in the private setting, what we're allowed to do is take the individual's needs first. So for example, we can have an individual on that very same team whose weakness, in fact, is not their power or their jumping ability, but is their strength. So once we've determined that the individual needs to improve on strength, we can give them a KPI based on what they need and not based on the team metric. So that KPI would be improving a 3-rep max squat. And then we can use that KPI then to determine what adaptation would best improve the KPI, which would be strength in this case. So doing near max effort squats will help us improve our 3-rep max squats, which will help the individual get stronger, which will hopefully feed into the team metric of helping the individual get more rebounds, thus helping the team get more rebounds. Again, on the flip side, we have our team setting where individual have to fit into the adaptation that's predetermined by the KPI that's determined to generally be the most influential on the team metric. At the end of the day, if an individual is getting better, the team's getting better, and we're all trying to improve the same team metric. Just the route to get there and the amount of specialization we can apply will vary depending on our setting. So as always, if you have any questions or comments, you can feel free to email us at info@ironperformance.ca or drop them in the comments below. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more videos such as this.